Before we begin, I want to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Maybe it's late at night. Maybe everyone around you is already asleep. Whatever time it is, wherever you are, welcome to Nockmeyer Witness. Now, let's get into tonight's story. I am sure this is supposed to be more along the lines of ghost stuff, but I am going to tell you about the most scared I have ever been in my life. Real fear, the kind that grabs your throat and squeezes until you cannot breathe, does not come from shadows in the corner or footsteps in the attic. It comes from looking into the eyes of someone you love and seeing a darkness there that you cannot reach. A decision already made behind a smile that looks almost normal. It comes from realizing that the person standing in front of you, the person who has been your anchor through everything, is planning to disappear forever, and there is nothing you can do to stop them except hold on and hope your grip is strong enough. Last year, a friend of mine passed away. We will call him Charlie. I am in the Army, have been for a few years now, and Charlie was one of those guys who made the hard days bearable, who could find a joke in the middle of a sandstorm, who made you feel like you were part of something bigger than yourself just by being around him. He had taken some frag to the leg in Iraq, a piece of shrapnel that tore through muscle and bone and left him with a scar he showed off like a trophy. But he pulled through, survived the surgery, survived the rehab, survived the long flight home and the months of physical therapy that followed. He was walking again, almost running, talking about re-enlisting, talking about the future, talking about all the things he was going to do now that he had been given a second chance. So when he died, it came out of nowhere, a phone call in the middle of the night that made no sense, that my brain refused to process for several minutes after I hung up. He was gone. Just like that. No warning, no explanation that felt sufficient, just the empty space where a person used to be. His death was a bit of a personal matter, something that happened after he got home, something that I still do not fully understand and probably never will. But all you guys need to know is that my other friend, who I will call Bill, took it very hard. This guy Bill has been my best friend in the military, the kind of friendship that forms in places where trust is not a luxury but a necessity, where your life depends on the person standing next to you and you learn to read their moods better than you read your own. He is that guy who everyone wants to hang around, a perfect blend of friendliness and confidence that makes people gravitate toward him without knowing why. He knows what is important and what is not, can cut through bullshit with a single sentence, can make you laugh when you are ready to cry, and make you cry when you are ready to give up. Most of all, he truly cares for people, not in a showy way, not in a way that demands recognition, but in the quiet moments when no one else is watching. When he checks on the new guy who looks homesick, when he stays up all night talking someone through a panic attack, when he gives away his last cigarette and his last dollar because someone else needs them more. Everyone who reads this will know the type of person I am talking about. The one who holds the group together, who becomes the center of gravity without trying, who makes you feel like you matter just by being in the same room. Anyhow, he is my best friend I have ever had, bar none. The kind of friend that comes along once in a lifetime, if you are lucky. The kind that changes who you are just by knowing them. So when Charlie died, I was worried about Bill. I knew how close they had been, knew that Bill had been the one who carried Charlie out of the firefight in Iraq, who held pressure on the wound while the medics scrambled, who rode in the helicopter with him and stayed at the hospital until they forced him to leave. I knew that Bill did not show his pain the way other people did, that he processed grief in silence, that he would smile and joke and be the rock for everyone else, while inside he was crumbling. But I did not know how far the crumbling had gone. I did not know that he was already planning his exit. So a week or so later, Charlie's family flew out to the nearby town, and we all decided to have a bit of a memorial. It was not an official military ceremony, nothing with flags and salutes and uniformed honor guards. It was just a gathering at a bar in town, a place where soldiers go to drink and remember and try to make sense of things that have no sense in them. Charlie's parents were there, his sister, a few cousins who had driven in from neighboring states. They were good people, warm and grateful, thanking us for being Charlie's friends, for being there at the end, for carrying his memory forward. It should have been a night of healing, of shared grief, of the kind of connection that reminds you why you wear the uniform and why the bonds you form in service are unlike anything else in the world. I was not yet 21 at this point, so I got to play the designated driver. That was fine with me. I did not feel like drinking anyway. Did not feel like trying to drown a sadness that was too big for any bottle to hold. I sat at the table with a soda, watching my friends and Charlie's family, trying to be present, trying to be helpful, trying not to think about the fact that Charlie was not there and never would be again. My buddy Bill was hitting the bottle hard, doing shots with everyone, downing pitchers left and right. That was not unusual for him, or at least it was not unusual for a night like this, a night when the pain demanded some kind of answer and alcohol was the only one anyone could find. He was laughing, toasting Charlie's memory, telling stories that made everyone smile through their tears. He looked like himself, sounded like himself, moved like himself. But something was different, something I could not name, a current running beneath the surface that made the hair on my arms stand up even though I could not say why. As the night went on, he seemed to get more and more serious. The laughter became less frequent, the smiles thinner, the pauses between words longer. He started staring at things that were not there. His eyes focused on a point somewhere over people's shoulders, somewhere in the middle distance where the rest of us could not see. He stopped initiating conversations, stopped responding to toasts, stopped being the center of gravity that pulled everyone toward him. The change was subtle at first, easy to miss in the noise and the alcohol and the general atmosphere of a memorial that was trying too hard to be a celebration. But I noticed. I noticed because I knew him, because I had spent years learning his rhythms, his tells, the way he held his shoulders when he was angry, and the way he tapped his fingers when he was nervous. And tonight, something was wrong, in a way that went beyond grief, beyond sadness, beyond the normal response to losing a friend. It was about 1 a.m. when he finally broke the surface. The bar was starting to empty out. Charlie's family had gone back to their hotel. The remaining soldiers were clustered in small groups, talking quietly, drinking slowly, avoiding the moment when the night would end and they would have to go back to barracks and face the empty darkness of their rooms. Bill walked up to me, moving with a precision that belied how much he had drunk, his steps steady, his eyes clear in a way that was more frightening than if he had been stumbling drunk. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath, and he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, a voice that cut through the bar noise like a blade through silk. "Hey, come outside with me while I smoke." It was not a request. It was a statement, delivered with a weight that made my stomach drop before I even understood why. I followed him, my soda forgotten on the table, my heart starting to beat faster with an instinct I could not explain. We both went out, pushing through the heavy door into the parking lot, where the night air was cold and sharp and smelled of asphalt and distant rain. He sat on a concrete block out in the parking lot, a low barrier that separated the lot from the street beyond, and he stared at the ground for a while. I stood next to him, shivering in my thin jacket, waiting for him to speak, afraid of what he might say, and more afraid of the silence that stretched between us like a chasm. Then he said the scariest thing I have ever heard someone say. "Gatos, after I go home tonight, I am going to kill myself." The words landed like a physical blow, like someone had punched me in the chest with all their strength. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt my vision narrow to a point, felt the world tilt on its axis and threaten to throw me off. I heard myself make a sound, not quite a word, not quite a gasp, something animal and broken that came from a place deeper than thought. He was still staring at the ground, his voice flat and matter of fact, as if he were telling me he was going to pick up milk on the way home, as if he were discussing the weather, as if the most terrible thing a person could say was just another item on a list of evening plans. Naturally, I started to freak out. The fear that had been building since I noticed his change in mood exploded into full-blown panic, a white-hot terror that burned through every rational thought and left only instinct. I started to try and talk him down, my words tumbling over each other, my voice rising to a pitch I did not recognize as my own. I told him he could not do this, told him Charlie would not want this, told him about everyone who loved him, everyone who needed him, everyone whose lives would be destroyed if he followed through. I told him about his family, his friends, the soldiers who looked up to him, the world that would be emptier without him in it. I told him anything I could think of, grasping at arguments like a drowning man grasping at straws, knowing even as I spoke that logic was not the enemy here, that the thing inside him was not listening to reason, that I was fighting a shadow with a flashlight. I ended up in tears. The panic turned to grief, the grief to desperation, and the tears came hot and fast, streaming down my face, making my voice crack, making my hands shake as I reached for him and he pulled away. He was telling me how he hated himself, how he had failed Charlie, how he had failed everyone, how the world would be better off without him taking up space and air and resources. He spoke with a conviction that was more terrifying than any anger, a calm certainty that he had weighed the options and found himself wanting, that he had done the math and the answer was clear, that his death was not a tragedy but a solution. I hit him in the face. I do not remember deciding to do it, do not remember pulling my arm back, do not remember the impact of my fist against his cheek. I just remember the sound, a sharp crack in the night air, and the way his head snapped to the side, and the look in his eyes when he turned back to me, not angry, not surprised, just sad, so sad, a sadness that went down to the bottom of his soul and kept going. He started to break down a bit. The mask cracked, the calm certainty shattered, and I saw what was underneath, a pain so vast and so deep that it made my own grief feel like a puddle beside an ocean. He started to cry, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body, that made the concrete block tremble beneath him, that tore sounds from his throat that no human should have to make. I held him, my arms wrapped around his shoulders, my face pressed against his neck, both of us crying now, both of us broken, both of us clinging to each other in a parking lot at 1 a.m. while the world slept on around us. Stuff started to go a little crazy. My squad leader ended up walking up to us, drawn by the noise or by some sixth sense that leaders develop, concerned and confused and demanding to know what was happening. That is the only time I have ever told him to fuck off and leave me alone. The words came out of my mouth with a force that surprised even me, a snarl of protective rage that was not about disrespect, but about survival, about the absolute necessity of keeping this moment private, of not letting anyone else in, of protecting Bill from being seen in this state by someone who might not understand. I will not leave you guys with some cliffhanger. Long story short, a few other friends came over and talked to him. They must have seen something in my face when I looked at them, some silent plea that transcended words, because they came without being asked, sat on the concrete block, formed a circle around Bill that was part intervention and part embrace. They talked to him, not at him, sharing their own fears, their own grief, their own moments of darkness, when they had thought about ending it all, and had somehow found the strength to keep going. They reminded him of who he was, of who we all were, of the family we had built in this uniformed world where blood was thicker than water and shared trauma was the glue that held us together. They did not fix him, did not cure him, did not make the pain go away, but they held him, literally and figuratively, until the worst of the storm passed, until the calm certainty of suicide became a distant thunder instead of an immediate deluge. After he had a good talk and gotten some feelings out, I threw him in my car. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, his eyes swollen and red, his body limp as a rag doll. I buckled him into the passenger seat, checked that he had no weapons on him, no pills, no rope, nothing that could be turned against himself in the hours before dawn. I was still terrified at this point, the fear not diminished by the tears or the talking or the presence of friends, but transformed into something colder, something more deliberate, a vigilance that would not let me rest until I knew he was safe. Mind you, I am still terrified at this point. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every dark stretch of road felt like a gauntlet. Every shadow between streetlights felt like an opportunity for him to open the door and run, to finish what he had started before I could stop him. We got back to the barracks, and I walked him back up to his room. He was stumbling now, the alcohol and the emotional exhaustion combining to make him unsteady on his feet. I guided him through the door, looked around his room for anything dangerous, anything sharp, anything that could be used to end a life. I found his belt, his bootlaces, his shaving razor, and I took them all, stuffing them into my pockets without explanation, without waiting for permission. Then I pushed him in the closet. It sounds crazy, I know. Sounds like something out of a bad movie. Sounds like the kind of thing you do when panic has replaced reason. But I was not thinking clearly, was operating on pure survival instinct, the need to contain him, to control the environment, to remove every possibility of harm. The closet was small, windowless, with a door that locked from the outside. It was the only space I could think of where he could sleep without hurting himself, where I could watch him without watching him, where the darkness might bring rest instead of opportunity. I closed the door and slept against it the entire night. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the wood, my legs stretched out in front of me, my head nodding forward and snapping back up every few minutes as exhaustion fought with terror for control of my body. I did not sleep, not really, just drifted in and out of a half-conscious state where every sound from the closet made me tense, every rustle of fabric made me ready to spring up and throw the door open. I listened to his breathing, the deep, slow rhythm of alcohol-induced sleep, and I counted each breath like a prayer, like a promise, like proof that he was still alive and still with me and still reachable. The floor was hard, the air was cold, my body ached in places I did not know could ache. But I did not move. I was the lock on that door, the barrier between my friend and the darkness that wanted him, and I would not let it have him without going through me first. The next morning, he ended up asking me why he was sleeping in the closet. He opened the door from the inside, the lock apparently not as secure as I had thought, and he stepped out blinking in the daylight, confused and hungover, and completely unaware of the night before. I told him the story, every terrible detail, every moment of fear and desperation and the physical violence I had used to keep him present. I told him about the parking lot, about the concrete block, about the words that had stopped my heart. I told him about the tears, the hit, the friends who had come, the drive back, the closet. I told him that he was not drinking for a very long fucking time. Emphasis on the fucking. My voice shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline, my hands still trembling as I made coffee and tried to act normal. He listened without speaking, his face going through a dozen emotions that I could not read, and when I was done, he just nodded. Not a promise, not an apology, not an explanation, just a nod that said he understood, that he was sorry, that he would try. We did not talk about it much after that, not directly, not in the way that therapists recommend. But something changed between us, a bond forged in the kind of fire that either destroys you or makes you unbreakable. We were unbreakable after that, not because the danger had passed, but because we had faced it together and survived. So kiddies, that is my story about fear. It is not your life you end up fearing for the most. It is the lives of those you love. Ghosts and monsters and things that go bump in the night are scary in their own way, but they are nothing compared to the terror of watching someone you care about slip away, of seeing the light go out behind their eyes, of knowing that the only thing standing between them and the abyss is you and your willingness to hold on no matter how hard they try to pull away. Real fear is not about what might happen to you. It is about what might happen to the people who make your life worth living, the people whose absence would create a hole that nothing could ever fill. It is about sitting on a closet floor all night, listening to someone breathe, praying that the morning will bring them back to themselves, knowing that if it does not, you will have to do it all again the next night, and the next, and the next, for as long as it takes, because that is what love demands, and that is what friendship means. I still think about that night, about the concrete block, about the words that stopped my heart. I think about what would have happened if I had not noticed the change in him, if I had been too drunk to drive, if I had dismissed his seriousness as just another stage of grief. I think about the closet door, about how easily it could have been unlocked from the inside, about how fragile my solution had been, how desperate, how inadequate. I think about the fact that he is still here, still alive, still my best friend, and I feel a gratitude so vast, it makes me want to weep. And I think about Charlie, about the friend we lost, about the hole he left behind that Bill tried to fill with his own death, and I understand now that grief is not a zero-sum game, that one person's absence does not demand another's, that the only way to honor the dead is to keep living, keep fighting, keep holding on to each other with everything we have. The most scared I have ever been was not in a war zone, not under fire, not facing an enemy I could see and shoot at. It was in a parking lot, in a town I cannot name, at 1 a.m, listening to my best friend tell me he was going to die, and knowing that the only weapon I had against his despair was my own refusal to let him go. That is the fear that stays with you, that wakes you up at 3 a.m. with your heart racing and your hands reaching for a phone to check that someone is still there. That is the fear that changes you, that makes you value every conversation, every laugh, every ordinary moment of connection, because you know how close you came to losing it all. And that is the fear I would wish on no one, but that I am strangely grateful for, because it taught me what matters, what lasts, what is worth fighting for when everything else falls away. This is not my story, but a former teacher told it to me and swears it is true. She was the kind of teacher who did not scare easily, who had spent decades in classrooms full of teenagers trying to frighten her with urban legends and ghost stories, who had heard every variation of every tale and had learned to separate the genuine from the fabricated. She was practical, grounded, the sort of person who graded papers in red ink and kept her desk organized and spoke about literature with a passion that made even the most reluctant students pay attention. So when she told this story, when her voice dropped to a whisper and her eyes went distant and her hands stopped moving on the desk, I knew I was hearing something that had actually happened to her. Something that had shaped her in ways she was still trying to understand decades later. She said that when she was a child, she shared a room with her younger sister. It was a modest bedroom in a modest house, the kind of place that families build their lives in without thinking too much about the walls around them or the shadows that gather in the corners when the lights go out. The room was not large, just big enough for two twin beds pushed against opposite walls, with a small window between them that looked out onto the backyard and the fence beyond. There was a closet in the corner, its door slightly crooked on its hinges, and a dresser that held their clothes and their treasures and the small objects that children collect without knowing why. It was a normal room, a safe room, a room that should have held nothing but the ordinary fears of childhood, the monsters under the bed that turn out to be dust bunnies, the shadows on the wall that are just trees moving in the wind. One night she was in her bed, lying on her back and staring at the ceiling, the way children do when sleep refuses to come and the mind starts to wander through half-formed thoughts and imagined scenarios. Her sister was in the other bed, rustling under the covers, also awake, also restless, also caught in that liminal space between day and night where reality feels soft and malleable. The house was quiet, the kind of deep quiet that settles over a home when everyone else is asleep, when the parents have gone to bed and the television has been turned off and the only sounds are the creaks of old wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The nightlight in the hallway cast a thin strip of yellow under the door, enough to see by if you needed to get up, enough to keep the darkness from feeling absolute. Her sister told her to look toward the door. The words came out of nowhere, sudden and sharp, cutting through the silence like a whispered shout. Her sister's voice was different somehow. Not the voice of a sleepy child, but the voice of someone who had seen something, who needed confirmation, who was afraid to be the only one witnessing whatever stood in the darkness. She said it again, more urgent this time, looked toward the door, and there was a tremor in her words that made the hair on the back of my teacher's neck stand up before she even turned her head. She looked up and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, impossibly tall, his head nearly brushing the top of the doorframe, his shoulders broad enough to block out the thin strip of light from the hallway. He was just a shape, a darkness darker than the darkness around him, a negative space where a person should be. She could not see his face, could not make out any features, could not determine whether he was looking at them or past them or through them, but she could feel his presence, a weight in the room that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe, a cold that seemed to radiate from his form and sink into her bones. He did not move. He just stood there, filling the doorway, silent and still, watching them with eyes she could not see but could feel, boring into her with an intensity that made her want to scream and cry and burrow under the covers all at once. She had a light switch right next to her bed, a small plastic toggle that she had used 1,000 times before without thinking, reaching out in the dark to turn on the lamp on her nightstand when she needed to find a dropped book or a glass of water. Her hand found it now, moving without conscious thought, her fingers closing around the switch, with a desperation that came from somewhere deeper than fear. She flicked it on, and the room exploded with light. the bulb overhead blazing to life, illuminating every corner, every shadow, every object in the room with a harsh white clarity that should have revealed everything. And there was nobody in the doorway. The man was gone. Not hiding, not retreating into the hallway, not slipping behind the door or ducking into the closet, just gone, vanished, as if he had never been there at all. The doorway was empty, the hallway beyond it dark and silent, the strip of light from the nightlight unchanged, undisturbed. My teacher sat up in bed, her heart hammering, her eyes scanning every corner of the room, searching for some explanation, some shadow that had looked like a man, some coat hanging on a hook, some trick of the light that her tired mind had turned into a figure. But there was nothing. The room was exactly as it had been. Her sister sitting up in the other bed with wide, frightened eyes, the covers pulled up to her chin. The silence now broken by their ragged breathing. They called for their dad. Their voices came out as whispers at first, then grew louder, then became shouts that cut through the quiet house and brought footsteps pounding up the stairs. He came in asking them what was wrong, his face creased with sleep, his hair sticking up, his voice thick with the confusion of a man who had been torn from dreams he could not remember. He was a good father, the kind who took his children's fears seriously even when he did not understand them, who knelt by their beds and listened without interrupting, who checked the closet and under the beds with a flashlight even though he was sure he would find nothing. They told him what they had seen, both of them speaking at once, their words tumbling over each other, describing the tall man in the doorway, the darkness that was darker than darkness, the feeling of being watched by something that should not have been there. He said it was probably just their eyes playing tricks on them. The words were gentle, delivered with the soft patience of a parent who has learned to navigate the landscape of childhood fears, who knows that monsters are real to children even when they are not real to adults. He told them about how the brain works at night, how tired eyes can turn shadows into shapes, how the mind can fill in gaps with things that are not there, how the darkness plays tricks on everyone, even grown-ups. He sat with them until they calmed down, until their breathing slowed, until their eyes grew heavy with the exhaustion that follows intense fear. He kissed their foreheads, turned off the overhead light, and left the nightlight burning in the hallway, a small concession to their terror, a promise that the darkness would not be allowed to grow too deep. He went back to bed, and eventually so did they. But the next day, my teacher went downstairs and saw her father sitting at the kitchen table, just staring. It was morning, the sun streaming through the windows, the house filled with the ordinary sounds of a family waking up, the coffee maker gurgling, the newspaper rustling, the dog scratching at the door to be let out. But her father was not moving. He was sitting in his usual chair, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that only he could see. His face was pale, drained of color, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying a weight that had not been there the day before. She had never seen him like this, never seen the man who was her rock, her protector, her source of certainty in an uncertain world, look so lost, so shaken, so afraid. She asked him what was wrong. The words came out small, hesitant, because part of her already knew. Part of her had known from the moment she saw his face that something had changed, that the night before had not ended when the light switched on, that the man in the doorway had followed them into the daylight in a way that shadows were not supposed to do. He did not answer at first, just kept staring, his fingers tightening around the cold mug until his knuckles went white. Then he turned to her, and his eyes were different, filled with a knowledge that he did not want to have, a recognition that made her stomach drop before he even spoke. He said, Was the man you saw a tall man? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible, changing everything. It was not the question of a skeptical parent trying to debunk a child's nightmare. It was the question of someone who knew, someone who had seen, someone who was hoping against hope that his daughters had imagined something that he had not. My teacher nodded, slowly, her throat too tight to speak, and she watched her father's face crumble, just for a moment, before he pulled himself back together, before he became the strong parent again, before he told her not to worry, that everything was fine, that she should go get ready for school. But she had seen it, that crack in his armor, that flash of terror that told her the man in the doorway was not a trick of the light, not a product of tired eyes, not a figment of childish imagination. He was real, and her father had seen him too. She claims that each member of the family saw the silhouette a number of times over the years. It was not a one-time event, not a shared hallucination that faded with the morning light, not a story that grew in the telling until it became larger than life. It was a recurring presence, a visitor who came without warning and left without explanation, a constant thread woven through the fabric of their family life. Her mother saw him first, standing in the doorway of the master bedroom while her father slept beside her, his tall form blocking out the hallway light, his silence more terrifying than any sound could have been. She switched on the lamp, and he was gone, and she told herself it was a dream, told herself she had been half asleep, told herself the stress of raising children was making her see things. She did not tell her husband, not at first, not wanting to worry him, not wanting to admit that something had entered their home that she could not explain. Her father saw him next, standing at the bottom of the stairs one evening when he came home late from work, his tall shape motionless in the darkness of the foyer, waiting. He had frozen on the steps, his hand still on the railing, his keys digging into his palm, and he had stared at the figure for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then he reached for the light switch on the wall, and the figure vanished, leaving only the empty foyer and the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He did not tell his wife, not wanting to frighten her, not wanting to give shape to a fear that he hoped was just his imagination. But he started leaving lights on after that, hallway lights, porch lights, lights in rooms that no one was using, a silent war against the darkness that he knew, deep down, he could not win. The younger sister saw him most often, or at least she admitted to seeing him most often. She would wake in the night and find him standing between their beds, his tall form blocking out the window, his head tilted down as if looking at them, though they could never see his eyes. She learned not to scream, not to wake her sister, not to draw attention to herself. She would just lie there, frozen, staring at the darkness where his face should be, waiting for morning to come and banish him back to wherever he went when the light returned. She told my teacher about it years later, when they were both adults, when the house was sold and the family had scattered, when the distance of time made the memories feel safer to share. She said she had seen him dozens of times, maybe more, and that she had never told anyone because she did not want to be thought crazy, did not want to be the sister who saw things, did not want to give the figure the satisfaction of knowing he had frightened her. And each time it was the same thing. They would turn on a light and there would be nobody there. The pattern never varied, never offered any new information, never gave them anything to hold on to except the certainty that they had seen something, that their eyes were not lying, that the darkness contained a presence that the light could not reveal. They tried everything over the years. They left lights burning all night, filling the house with a brightness that made sleep impossible, but kept the figure at bay. They moved furniture, rearranged rooms, changed the layout of the house in hopes that the disruption would break whatever pattern allowed him to appear. They brought in a priest, then a minister, then a friend who claimed to have experience with these things, each one performing their rituals, their prayers, their cleansings, each one leaving with reassurances that the house was clear, that the presence was gone, that there was nothing to fear. And still he came. The figure never did anything. That was perhaps the worst part, the thing that made the fear so much deeper than it would have been if he had attacked, or spoken, or even moved. He just stood there, watching, waiting, his tall form a black hole in the fabric of their reality, his silence more eloquent than any threat could have been. He never stepped into the room, never crossed the threshold of whatever doorway he occupied, never reached out with hands they could not see. He just observed, a sentinel in the darkness, a witness to their sleeping lives, a reminder that there were borders in the world that the light could not protect, boundaries that could be crossed by things that did not obey the rules of physics or logic or common sense. My teacher moved out when she went to college, and she told herself that the figure was behind her, that the house was the problem, that distance would break whatever connection had allowed him to haunt her childhood. And for a while, it seemed to work. She slept through the night without waking, walked through dark hallways without fear, lived in apartments and dorm rooms where the only shadows were the ordinary shadows of furniture and walls. But then she went home for Christmas one year, her first year away, and she woke in her old bedroom to find him standing in the doorway, exactly as he had stood when she was a child, exactly as tall, exactly as silent, exactly as terrifying. She switched on the light and he was gone, but the message was clear. He was not tied to the house. He was tied to her family, to something in their blood or their history or their souls that she could not understand and could not escape. She stopped going home after that, found excuses for holidays, sent gifts instead of visiting, built a life in another city where the figure did not appear, where the nights were quiet and the doorways were empty. But she never forgot. She never stopped wondering who he was, what he wanted, why he had chosen her family, why he never did anything except stand and watch. She researched, read books about ghosts and shadow people and entities that exist at the edge of human perception, searching for some name, some category, some explanation that would make the fear manageable. She found stories that matched hers, accounts of tall, dark figures who appeared in doorways and at the foot of beds, who vanished when the lights came on, who never spoke, never touched, never revealed their purpose. Some called them shadow people, some called them watchers, some called them harbingers of death or illness or misfortune. But no one knew for sure what they were, where they came from, what they wanted. She told me this story in the classroom after school one day, when the other students had gone home and the building was quiet and the afternoon light was fading into evening. She told it without drama, without embellishment, without any attempt to make it scarier than it already was. She just spoke, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the window where the shadows were growing longer. She said she had never told a student before, had never told anyone outside her family except her husband, who had listened with the same skepticism she had once felt, the same desperate hope that there was a rational explanation. But she wanted me to know, she said, because I had asked about fear, about real fear, about the things that haunt us beyond the stories we tell around campfires. She wanted me to understand that the world is larger than we think, that the darkness contains things we are not equipped to see, that the line between imagination and reality is thinner than any of us want to admit. I have been creeped out ever since she told me this story. It sits in my mind like a stone, heavy and cold, surfacing at the worst moments, in the dark, in the quiet, when I am alone in a room and the doorway is just a rectangle of deeper darkness. I find myself reaching for light switches with a desperation I did not have before, flipping on lamps and overhead lights and phone flashlights at the slightest hint of shadow, needing the brightness like a drowning man needs air. I sleep with the hallway light on now, a small bulb that burns electricity and comfort in equal measure, a feeble barrier against whatever might be standing in the doorway while I dream. I check my doorways before I enter rooms, my heart pounding, my breath held, expecting to see him, the tall man, the silhouette, the watcher who does not move and does not speak and does not leave. I have never seen him. I tell myself I never will, that the figure belongs to my teacher's family, to their house, to their history, to something in their blood that I do not share. But the fear persists, irrational and consuming, because I know now that these things are possible, that the darkness is not empty, that the light reveals only what it chooses to reveal, and hides the rest in shadows that move when we are not looking. I know that my teacher, practical and grounded and skeptical, saw something that changed her, that marked her, that she carries with her still. Decades later, in the tremor of her hands and the distance in her eyes. And I know that if it could happen to her, in her ordinary house, with her ordinary family, it could happen to anyone. It could happen to me. So I keep the lights on. I keep my eyes open. And I keep listening, in the dark, in the quiet, for the sound of my sister's voice telling me to look toward the door, for the weight of a presence that should not be there, for the moment when the silhouette appears and the light does nothing to banish it. Because my teacher taught me something that day, something more important than any lesson in her curriculum, something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She taught me that fear is not always about what we see. Sometimes it is about what we cannot see, what stands in the doorway watching, what waits in the darkness beyond the reach of our lights, what knows our names and our faces and our fears, and what comes back again and again, not to hurt us, not to speak to us, but simply to remind us that we are never truly alone, and that the things that share our space are not always friendly, and that the light we trust to protect us is just a switch away from going out, leaving us in the dark with whatever has been waiting all along. I still think about her father, sitting at the kitchen table, staring into space, asking if the man was tall. I think about the weight of that question, the knowledge it carried, the shared terror it revealed between a parent and a child who had both seen something they could not explain. I think about the years of silence that followed, the unspoken agreement not to talk about it, the pretense of normalcy that covered a household haunted by a presence that never harmed them but never left them alone. And I think about my teacher, now retired, living somewhere far from that house, in a home full of light, surrounded by lamps and nightlights and the glow of screens that never go dark, still paying the electric bill for a peace of mind that she knows, deep down, is just an illusion, because he is still out there, somewhere, in the darkness between doorways, in the space where the light does not reach, waiting for the next family, the next child, the next person who looks up in the night and sees something standing where nothing should be. I was 16 years old when it happened, an age when most kids are worried about homework and crushes and whether they will ever figure out who they are supposed to become. I was not a particularly imaginative teenager, not the type who read horror novels or watched scary movies or went looking for ghost stories online. I was practical, grounded, The kind of kid who rolled their eyes at tales of the supernatural and laughed when friends claimed their houses were haunted. I believed in what I could see and touch and explain with science, and I slept with my door open, because the closed darkness felt more suffocating than whatever might be lurking in the hallway beyond. That changed one night, and it changed forever, and I have not slept with a door open since. I woke up in the middle of the night to seeing my clothes being rustled about in my doorway. After washing my clothes, I liked to hang dry them on my doorframe, a habit I had developed because the dryer in our old house was broken more often than it worked, and the summer air that drifted through the hallway did a better job than any machine. My t-shirts and jeans and socks were draped over the top of the door, held in place by the weight of the wood, swaying gently in the breeze that came from the open window at the end of the hall. But this movement was different. It was not the soft sway of fabric in a draft. It was a rustling, a shifting, a deliberate disturbance, as if someone was pushing through the clothes, parting them like curtains, moving from the hallway into my room. My eyes were still heavy with sleep, my mind foggy, caught in that strange state where dreams and reality blur together and you are not sure which is which. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, trying to convince myself that I was still dreaming, that the movement was just the wind, that my tired brain was manufacturing shapes from shadows. But the rustling continued, and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw something that made my breath stop in my throat. I noticed some really gray, veiny-looking legs first. They were thin, impossibly thin, like the legs of a spider or a creature that had never known food or warmth or the touch of sunlight. The skin was the color of old concrete, of ash, of something that had been buried and dug up and left to dry in the dark. And the veins, they were not the blue lines that run beneath human skin, subtle and soft. They were thick and dark and raised, pulsing with a rhythm that I could see even in the dim light, branching across the legs like the roots of a dead tree, like cracks in dried mud, like the map of a river system drawn by a madman. The legs ended in feet that were too long, too narrow, the toes splayed and grasping, pressing into the carpet with a weight that should not have been possible for something so thin. Then I saw these really long, pointed sticks moving through my clothes. They were reaching up from below the legs, from the darkness that filled the lower half of the doorway, pushing through my hanging shirts and jeans with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. The sticks were fingers. That realization hit me like a physical blow, a wave of nausea that rose from my stomach and threatened to spill out of my mouth. They were fingers, longer than any human fingers could ever be, longer than my forearm, jointed in too many places, bending at angles that made my own fingers ache in sympathetic pain. They were pointed at the tips, sharp and yellowed, like the claws of some deep sea creature that had never evolved to need softness or touch. It took me a second, but my sleepy eyes adjusted to see one of the most grotesque demon-looking creatures I have ever seen. He was extremely skinny, his body a collection of angles and bones and stretched skin that seemed too tight in some places and too loose in others. His ribs pressed against his gray flesh like the bars of a cage, each one visible, each one moving with a breath that I could not hear but could see, the skin rising and falling in a rhythm that was wrong, too fast, too shallow, like a small animal in panic. But his stomach was distended, swollen and round and obscene, hanging from his torso like a tumor, like a pregnancy, like something that had been stuffed inside him against his will. It moved independently of his breathing, pulsing and shifting, as if whatever was inside was still alive, still hungry, still waiting to be born. His skin was gray and veiny, The same terrible pattern that covered his legs extending across his entire body, a network of dark lines that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, that pulsed with a light that was not light at all, but something else. Something that existed in a spectrum my eyes were not meant to see. And those long sticks were his fingers. I could see that now. See how they connected to hands that were too large for his wrists. See how the hands connected to arms that were too long for his body. See how the arms hung at his sides, like the limbs of a puppet with cut strings, swaying slightly. The pointed fingers brushing against his thighs with a sound like dry leaves scraping on concrete. His chin was long, impossibly long, jutting forward from his face like the prow of a ship, like the beak of some predatory bird, like a deformity that had been cultivated rather than born. It was pointed, sharp. The skin stretched so thin across the bone that I could see the shape of his jaw beneath, the individual teeth pressing against the inside of his cheeks. His eyes had no lids on them, no protection, no blinking, no humanity. They were unusually big, too big for his skull, round and bulbous and wet, reflecting the dim light from the hallway in a way that made them seem to glow from within. They were yellow, the color of old pus, of infected wounds, of something that had been sick for a very long time, and they were fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering, drinking in every detail of my face with a hunger that I could feel in my bones. His tiny mouth was in a pucker, a small dark hole in the center of his long face, moving constantly, rhythmically, opening and closing in a pattern that reminded me of something I could not name. It looked like he was eating an imaginary lollipop. That was the only way my terrified brain could process it. A sucking motion, a chewing motion, a mouth working on something that was not there, something that only he could taste. The lips were thin, almost invisible, just a dark line around the hole, and when they parted I could see teeth that were small and sharp and too numerous, crowded into a space that could not contain them, jutting at angles, overlapping, pressing against each other in their eagerness to escape. His hunchback looked as though it tore out of the strange hospital gown he was wearing. The gown was white, or had been white once, now stained with things I did not want to identify, yellow and brown and dark red, hanging from his shoulders in strips, the fabric stretched and torn by the protrusion of his spine. The hump itself was massive, a growth that dominated his upper back, pushing his head forward and down, giving him a posture that was both submissive and predatory, like a wolf that has learned to beg. The skin over the hump was thinner than anywhere else, stretched to transparency, and I could see shapes moving beneath it, things that shifted and pressed against the surface, as if trying to break free. He just stared at me, those lidless yellow eyes locked onto mine, with a focus that was absolute, that stripped away every layer of protection I had, that laid bare my thoughts and my fears and my soul for his inspection. He did not move, did not speak, did not make any sound beyond the wet smacking of his tiny mouth. He just stared, and in that stare I felt something worse than threat, worse than hunger, worse than malice. I felt surprise. He was surprised I could see him. That was the impression that burned itself into my memory, the thing that still makes me wake up sweating in the middle of the night. He had not expected to be seen. He had come through my doorway, parted my clothes, entered my room, believing himself invisible, believing himself safe in the shadows, believing that I was just another sleeping child who would never know he had been there, and now I was looking at him, really looking, and he did not know what to do. I tried to scream my grandmother awake. She was sharing a room with me for the weekend, sleeping in a cot that my parents had set up near the window, her breathing soft and rhythmic, the sound of peaceful sleep that I had found comforting just moments before. I opened my mouth to scream, to shout, to make any sound that would break the spell and bring her running. But my throat was frozen, locked by a terror that bypassed my vocal cords and gripped my entire body in a paralysis that felt physical, felt like something was holding me down, pressing against my chest, pinning me to the mattress. I could not make a sound. I could not move. I could only stare back at him, my eyes wide, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs and land on the floor between us. He would not stop staring. Those yellow eyes bored into me, searching, questioning, surprised but not afraid, never afraid. I stared back, trapped in a mutual gaze that felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only seconds, maybe minutes. Time losing all meaning in the presence of something that did not obey the rules of the world I knew. And I tried to shake my grandmother awake, my hand reaching out from under the covers, my fingers finding her shoulder, gripping with a desperation that should have woken anyone, that should have left bruises, that should have drawn blood. But she did not stir. She slept on, peaceful, unaware, while I shook her with all the strength I had, while the creature in the doorway watched me struggle, while the world tilted on its axis and threatened to throw me off. I started noticing other things about him, details that my terror had initially blocked out, details that seared themselves into my memory with the permanence of a brand. How large and cone-like his head was, the skull expanding upward and outward from his face in a shape that was not human, not animal, not anything that evolution on Earth had ever produced. It was bald, completely hairless, the gray skin pulled tight across bone that jutted at impossible angles, ridges and protrusions that served no purpose I could understand. How hairless and shriveled he looked as he stood still, his entire body a monument to decay, to starvation, to something that had been alive for too long, in conditions that should have killed it, that had survived by becoming something that should not exist. He stood still, surprised I could see him. That was the expression I read in his face, in the tilt of his cone-shaped head, in the slight widening of his lidless eyes. He had been caught, discovered, exposed, and he was processing this new information, deciding what to do with it, deciding what to do with me. I could see the calculation in those yellow eyes, the weighing of options, the consideration of consequences. He could kill me, I knew that, felt it in the pointed fingers and the sharp teeth and the thing that moved beneath his humped back. He could silence me, make me just another story that no one would believe, another teenager who had a nightmare and woke up screaming. But he did not move. He just stared, and I stared back, and the silence stretched between us like a wire pulled tight, vibrating with tension, ready to snap. My grandmother woke up. I do not know what finally roused her, whether it was my shaking, or some sound I made that I could not hear, or some instinct that grandmothers have, some protective sense that cuts through sleep when a grandchild is in danger. She stirred, groaned, turned her head toward me, and in that moment, in the split second when her eyes were still closed and her mind was still foggy, I felt a surge of hope, so intense it hurt. I opened my mouth to warn her, to tell her not to look, to keep her eyes closed, to pretend she was still asleep. But before I could speak, she looked toward the door, and he was gone. Not retreating, not fading, not melting into the shadows like smoke. Just gone, vanished, as if he had never been there at all, as if the doorway had always been empty, as if my hanging clothes had always been still, as if the entire encounter had been a product of my terrified imagination. My grandmother blinked, confused, her eyes scanning the doorway and finding nothing but darkness and fabric and the ordinary shapes of a house at night. She asked me what was wrong, her voice thick with sleep, her hand reaching out to touch my forehead, checking for fever, checking for illness. checking for the ordinary explanations that grandmothers reach for when their grandchildren wake them in the night. I could not answer her. My throat was still frozen, my body still paralyzed, my mind reeling from the absence of the thing that had been there just a moment before. I looked at the doorway, empty now, innocent now, and I felt a terror that was worse than the sight of the creature had been. Because he had disappeared when she looked, because he had chosen to hide himself from her, because he could have stayed, could have revealed himself to both of us, could have made his presence known to the world beyond my eyes. But he had not. He had vanished, and that meant he was in control, that he was choosing who saw him and when, that my sight had been a mistake, an accident, a glitch in whatever system allowed him to move unseen through the world. I told her I had a bad dream. It was the only thing I could say, the only explanation that would not result in a trip to the hospital or a call to a psychiatrist or a long conversation about stress and adolescence and the power of imagination. She accepted it, patted my hand, told me to go back to sleep, turned over and drifted off within minutes. But I did not sleep. I lay there, staring at the doorway, waiting for him to return, waiting for those gray, veiny legs to reappear, waiting for the rustle of my clothes and the pointed fingers and the lidless yellow eyes. I waited until morning, until the sunlight filled the room and made the shadows retreat, until the ordinary world returned and I could almost convince myself that it had been a dream, that my stressed-out teenage brain had manufactured the whole thing. But it had not been a dream. I knew that then, and I know it now, with a certainty that has only grown stronger with time. Because in the weeks leading to this encounter, I had been experiencing strange things in my house, things that I had dismissed as imagination, as coincidence, as the normal weirdness of growing up in an old building with creaky floors and drafty windows. My bedroom door slamming and locking on its own, the heavy wood shaking in its frame as if someone on the other side was trying to get in, or trying to keep me from getting out. The lock clicking into place with a sound like a gunshot, trapping me inside, while I sat on my bed and stared at the door and felt something on the other side, something that wanted in, something that was patient enough to wait. One night I woke up to what felt like several hands touching my feet and legs. Not one hand, not two, but many, too many to count, pressing against my skin through the blankets, cold and dry and insistent, moving upward from my ankles to my knees to my thighs with a slowness that was more terrifying than speed would have been. I kicked, I thrashed, I threw off the covers and found nothing, no one. Just the empty room and the darkness and the lingering sensation of fingers that had been there, that had touched me, that had wanted something I could not name. And the horrible nightmares, dreams that were not dreams, visions of the gray creature before I had seen him, of his cone-shaped head and his lidless eyes and his long pointed fingers, dreams that felt more real than waking life, that left me gasping and sweating and afraid to close my eyes again. After the experience with this strange gray man, I told my parents. I had to. The fear was too big to contain, too real to hide, too consuming to pretend away. I told them everything, every detail, every sensation, every moment of paralysis and surprise and the wet smacking of that tiny mouth. They listened with the careful attention of parents who love their child, but do not know what to do with what they are hearing. They asked questions, gentle questions, trying to find the rational explanations, the stress, the sleep deprivation, the overactive imagination of a teenager under pressure. But I could see in their eyes that something in my description had reached them, something that bypassed their skepticism and touched a primal nerve, a recognition of something they had heard before, in stories from their own childhoods, in whispers from older relatives, in the folklore that every culture carries about the things that watch from doorways. They had my room exorcised. I do not know who they called, do not know if it was a priest or a minister or someone from one of the old traditions that my grandmother knew but never spoke about. I was not allowed in the room while it happened, was sent to stay with a friend for the weekend, was told only that everything would be fine when I came back. And when I did come back, when I walked into my room with my heart pounding and my eyes scanning every corner, something was different. The air felt lighter, the shadows felt shallower, the doorway felt like just a doorway instead of a portal to somewhere else. I did not see him again. The door stopped slamming, the hands stopped touching my feet, the nightmares faded into ordinary dreams that I could forget by morning. I do not know if an exorcism really made those horrible things stop or gave me peace of mind from things I was manifesting myself. That is the question that still circles my mind on quiet nights, the doubt that still whispers when I am alone in the dark. Maybe it was all in my head, the product of a stressed-out teenage brain, the collision of hormones and anxiety and the power of suggestion that old houses and ghost stories provide. Maybe the exorcism was just a placebo, a ritual that worked because I believed it would work, because my parents believed it would work, because the act of doing something, anything, was enough to break the cycle of fear that had been feeding on itself. Maybe the gray man was just a nightmare that bled into waking, a hypnagogic hallucination, a trick of the mind in the vulnerable moments between sleep and consciousness. All I know is I do not experience those things anymore. The room is quiet now, has been quiet for years. Through the rest of my adolescence and into my adulthood. I moved out eventually, went to college, got an apartment, built a life that does not include old houses with creaky doors and drafty windows. But I have never forgotten him, never stopped seeing those yellow eyes in my memory, never stopped feeling the weight of his surprise when he realized I could see him, and I will never sleep with a door open again. That is the legacy he left me, the small trauma that persists long after the terror has faded. Every night, without fail, I check the lock, I pull the door shut, I make sure that the gap between the door and the frame is as narrow as possible, that no light from the hallway can seep through, that nothing can slip into my room while I sleep. Sometimes, in the dark, I still feel like he is out there, somewhere, moving through doorways, parting clothes with his long, pointed fingers, standing in the shadows and staring at sleeping children with his lidless yellow eyes. I wonder how many others have seen him. How many have woken to the rustle of fabric and the gray, veiny legs and the cone-shaped head. I wonder if he is still surprised when someone sees him, if he still stands still, calculating, deciding what to do with the ones who can perceive what should be invisible. I wonder if he has found other rooms, other doorways, other teenagers who hang their clothes to dry and leave their doors open to the night. And I wonder what he wanted from me, what he was doing in my room that night. What would have happened if my grandmother had not woken up, if I had been alone, if the paralysis had lasted a moment longer? The questions have no answers, and maybe that is the scariest part of all. Not the creature himself, with his grotesque form and his terrible stillness, but the not knowing, the forever wondering, the permanent uncertainty about whether he was real or imagined, whether the exorcism worked or whether he simply moved on, whether he is still out there waiting for the next time I leave a door open, the next time I hang my clothes where he can part them, the next time I wake in the dark and find myself staring into yellow eyes that do not blink and a tiny mouth that smacks and sucks on something I cannot see. I am older now, supposedly wiser, supposedly better equipped to handle the mysteries of the world. But on nights when the house is quiet and the darkness presses close, I still check the lock twice. I still pull the covers up to my chin. I still listen for the rustle of clothes in a doorway that should be empty. And I still remember the surprise in those lidless eyes, the shock of being seen, the calculation of what to do with someone who had broken the rules by perceiving what was meant to remain hidden. Because whatever he was, whatever he is, he did not expect me to see him. And that means there are things in this world that rely on our blindness, that depend on our disbelief, that move through our lives unseen and unchallenged, because most of us are too sensible, too rational, too asleep to notice them. But I noticed. I saw him. And I have been paying the price ever since, in locked doors and sleepless nights, and the permanent question of whether what I saw was real or whether my stressed-out teenage brain created a monster to explain the fear that had no name. I do not know the answer. I will never know the answer. All I know is that I will never sleep with a door open again, and that somewhere, in the space between darkness and light, in the gap between sleeping and waking, in the rustle of clothes hanging on a door frame, he is still there, still watching, still surprised when someone sees him, still deciding what to do with the ones who can perceive what the rest of the world refuses to see. When I was in elementary school, my family decided to add on to our house. It was supposed to be an exciting project, something that would give us more space, more light, more room to grow as a family. My parents had been planning it for years, sketching ideas on napkins during dinner, paging through home magazines on Sunday afternoons, debating whether the new space should be a sunroom or an extra bedroom or a play area for me and my brother. We lived in an old colonial home that was built to be historically correct, a house that my parents had fallen in love with before they even knew they could afford it. It had 200-year-old softwood floors that creaked in specific spots so you could tell who was walking where, proper paint colors that had been researched and approved by historical societies, a front porch with columns that looked like something from a picture book about early America. My parents were proud of that house, proud of its history, proud of the way they had maintained its character while making it livable for a modern family. The addition was supposed to honor that legacy, to blend seamlessly with the original structure so that no one could tell where the old house ended and the new one began. Because of this commitment to historical accuracy, my parents chose to have all of the wood trim in the addition painted rather than stained. It was a controversial decision in the world of old house restoration, one that sparked debates at dinner parties and earned raised eyebrows from neighbors who thought natural wood was the only acceptable choice. But my parents had a vision, a specific aesthetic they wanted to achieve, and they were willing to fight for it. They hired an architect first, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a portfolio full of restored colonial homes, who drew up plans that made my mother cry with happiness when she saw them. Then they hired a contractor, a gruff man with a thick mustache and a truck that smelled like sawdust and cigarettes, who shook my father's hand and promised to bring the vision to life. The contractor did not want to paint the trim. He argued with my parents for months, sending increasingly frustrated emails, showing up at the house unannounced to make his case in person, bringing samples of stained wood that he thought would change their minds. He thought it was a waste of time, he said, a waste of money, a waste of good quality wood that they had specifically sourced from a historic mill in Vermont. The wood was beautiful, he insisted, rich with grain and character, and covering it with paint was like putting a veil over a beautiful face. My parents listened politely, thanked him for his opinion, and held firm. They had hired him to execute their vision, not his, and the painted trim was non-negotiable. The tension grew, the arguments became more heated, and after about a year of fighting and having almost no work done on the house, My parents made a decision that would change everything. Even though the contractor and his team were consistently being paid, the work had stalled. Subcontractors showed up sporadically, did a few hours of work, and disappeared for weeks. Materials sat in the yard, warping in the rain, fading in the sun. The addition was framed, roofed, and walled, but the interior was bare studs and exposed wiring, a skeleton of a room that looked more like a construction site than part of a home. My parents were frustrated, my father was angry, and the money was flowing out with nothing to show for it. They consulted their lawyer, a family friend who had helped them buy the house and navigate its historical restrictions, and he recommended they cut their losses and find someone new. So they fired the first contractor, paid him what they legally owed, and started the search for someone who would actually finish the job. The new contractor was one that my parents' lawyer had met through church. He was a different kind of man altogether, soft-spoken and polite, with a handshake that was firm but not aggressive, and a smile that reached his eyes. He ran a smaller operation, a crew of 5 or 6 guys who had worked together for years, most of whom also went to that same church. My parents found this comforting. The idea that their home would be worked on by men of faith, by people who shared their values, by a community that looked out for one another. They did not check references as thoroughly as they had with the first contractor, did not ask for background checks, did not dig into the histories of the individual workers. They trusted the lawyer, trusted the church connection, trusted that good people would do good work. It was a trust that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. We always tried to be hospitable towards the workmen. My mother believed that kindness bred kindness, that a cold drink on a hot day or a plate of cookies in the afternoon made people work harder and care more about the quality of their labor. We live in a hot, humid climate that is pretty much unbearable for half the year, where the air feels like soup and the sweat pours down your back before you have walked 10 feet. The workmen would arrive early in the morning, trying to beat the worst of the heat, but by noon the temperature would be climbing toward 90 degrees, and the humidity would make it feel like 110. So my mom would send me outside with lemonade and the like for the workers, plastic pitchers filled with ice and tart yellow liquid that left condensation on the outside and wet rings on whatever surface it touched. I was 9 years old at the time, old enough to carry a tray without spilling, old enough to hold conversations, old enough to be trusted with small responsibilities. I would walk out to the addition in my shorts and t-shirt, my sneakers crunching on the gravel driveway, the sun beating down on my head, and I would offer the drinks to whoever was working that day. They were all really nice, at least to my 9-year-old perception. They would wipe their brows with bandanas, accept the lemonade with grateful smiles, ask me about school or my favorite cartoons or whether I was excited about the new room. I remember having nice conversations with them about whatever now 9-year-old me found interesting, my voice high and earnest, my words tumbling out in the way that children do when they are excited to be treated like adults. I particularly remember this one guy named Kenny. He was younger than most of the crew, maybe in his early 20s, with sandy hair that stuck out from under his baseball cap and a gap-toothed smile that made him look friendly, approachable, safe. The actual contractor never showed up on the job, something that my parents found odd but not alarming, since the work was progressing steadily and the quality seemed good. Kenny was put in charge, kind of like a gopher, the guy who ran errands, fetched supplies, supervised the day-to-day operations while the boss handled paperwork and other projects. He was always really nice to me, nicer than the others somehow, more attentive, more interested in what I had to say. He would kneel down to my level when we talked, his eyes level with mine, his voice soft and patient. He remembered my name, asked about my brother, commented on my drawings, made me feel special in a way that 9-year-olds crave. Anyways, a few months after they had finally finished the edition on our house, I think it took about 2.5 years from start to finish, Kenny's name was published in the newspaper. It was a small article, buried in the local section. The kind of thing that most people skim past on their way to the sports scores or the weather forecast. But my mother saw it, and I remember the sound she made, a sharp intake of breath that was not quite a gasp, not quite a scream, something in between that made me look up from my cereal with a sudden cold feeling in my stomach. She was staring at the paper, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. My father took the paper from her, read the article, and his face went through a series of expressions that I had never seen before, moving from confusion to shock to something that looked like rage mixed with terror. Kenny was put in prison for charges of pedophilia. The article was vague, careful with details, but the gist was clear enough for anyone who knew how to read between the lines. He had been caught with inappropriate images, had been accused of inappropriate contact with a minor, had been arrested after an investigation that had apparently been ongoing for months. The details spilled out in the days that followed, through whispered phone calls between my parents, through conversations with the lawyer, through the kind of gossip that spreads through small communities like wildfire. Before he worked at our house, he had been on a list of sex offenders. He had a record, a history, a pattern of behavior that should have prevented him from ever being alone with children, from ever being hired to work in a family home, from ever kneeling down to a 9-year-old girl's level and making her feel special with his soft voice and his gap-toothed smile. The contractor found this detail about his employee unnecessary to share with my parents. When confronted, he claimed he did not know, claimed Kenny had passed a background check, claimed the church connection had been enough to vouch for his character. But the truth came out eventually, through the lawyer's investigation, through records that could not be hidden. The contractor had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to know that Kenny had a past, enough to know that he should not be around children, enough to know that my parents would never have hired him if they had been told. But the contractor had kept it quiet, had prioritized his business and his convenience over the safety of the family whose home he was working in, had looked my parents in the eye every Sunday at church, and said nothing about the predator he had placed in their midst. I was an elementary-aged girl at the time. That fact hits me now with a weight that I could not feel as a child, a crushing realization of what could have happened, what might have happened, what probably would have happened if circumstances had been slightly different. My brother was in middle school, old enough to be left alone, old enough to look out for me, but not old enough to recognize danger in a smiling face, not old enough to understand that evil does not announce itself with horns and a tail, but with lemonade and conversations about cartoons. My parents would leave us home alone with the workmen there on occasion, running errands, attending meetings, trusting that the house was safe because the workers were from the church, because they seemed nice, because the world was supposed to be a place where 9-year-old girls could carry lemonade to friendly men without fear. Thinking about this still gives me the creeps. I cannot fully explain the feeling that comes over me when I remember Kenny, when I picture his face, when I hear his voice in my memory asking about my favorite color or whether I liked the new edition. It is not just fear, though there is plenty of that. It is a deeper discomfort, a sense of violation that exists in the space between what happened and what could have happened, between the innocence of my childhood perception and the adult knowledge of what he was. I cannot look at photographs from that time without scanning the background for his face, cannot walk through the edition without remembering where he stood, where he knelt, where he looked at me with eyes that I now understand were calculating, assessing, waiting, The addition is beautiful now, finished and painted and furnished, a seamless blend of old and new that guests always compliment. But for me, it will always be tainted, always carry the shadow of what I did not know then, but know now. The painted trim that my parents fought for looks perfect, exactly as they envisioned. But I cannot touch it without thinking of Kenny's hands, of where they had been, of what they had done, of how close they had come to touching me. The windows let in beautiful light, but I cannot stand by them without remembering him standing there, smiling, watching. The floorboards creak in the same rhythm as the rest of the house, but to my ears they sound different in that room, heavier, more final, like footsteps that should not have been there. I have tried to reconstruct my memories, to find the moments where something might have happened, where I might have been in danger, where my parents' trust was almost betrayed in the most terrible way. I remember being alone with Kenny once, in the kitchen, while my mother ran to the grocery store. He was fixing a cabinet hinge, or pretending to, and he asked me to hand him a screwdriver from the drawer. Our hands touched when I gave it to him, his fingers warm and slightly calloused, and he held on for a second longer than necessary, his smile widening, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that I thought was just friendliness. Was that it? Was that the moment where something almost began, where his control almost slipped, where my innocence almost ended? Or was it nothing, just a moment between a workman and a child, misremembered and misinterpreted through the lens of adult knowledge? I will never know. That is perhaps the worst part, the uncertainty that festers like a wound that never fully heals. I was not assaulted, was not touched inappropriately, was not harmed in any way that I can name or prove, but I was placed in danger, my parents were deceived, my childhood was infiltrated by someone who should never have been allowed near me. The what-ifs circle my mind like vultures, picking at the edges of my peace, demanding attention, demanding answers that do not exist. What if my mother had stayed home that day? What if my brother had been paying attention instead of playing video games in his room? What if Kenny had been alone with me for 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, an hour? What if the arrest had come a week later, a month later, after he had found his opportunity? My parents carry their own guilt, though I have told them repeatedly that it is not their fault, that they were deceived, that the contractor and the church connection were designed to bypass their natural caution. But I see it in their eyes when we talk about that time, in the way my mother's hand tightens around her coffee cup, in the way my father's jaw clenches. They left me alone with him. They trusted the wrong people. They prioritized the completion of a house over the safety of their daughter, not because they were negligent, but because they were human, because they wanted to believe in the goodness of people, because the world had not yet taught them the lesson that it would teach them through Kenny's smiling face and hidden history. I am older now, an adult with my own home and my own responsibilities, and I have learned to be careful in ways that my parents were not. I check backgrounds obsessively, ask questions that make service people uncomfortable, refuse to leave my own children alone with anyone whose history I cannot verify. My husband thinks I am paranoid sometimes, and maybe I am, but I have earned that paranoia through experience, through the knowledge that predators do not look like monsters, that they look like Kenny, that they smile and kneel and remember your name and make you feel special while calculating their next move. I have earned the right to be suspicious, to be vigilant, to be the kind of parent who might seem overprotective to outsiders, but who knows, deep in her bones, what can happen when trust is misplaced. The number of people with similar experiences is kind of frightening. Since sharing my story, I have heard from dozens of others, friends and strangers alike, who had their own Kennys, their own smiling workmen, their own church-connected contractors, who place danger in the heart of family homes. It is good to see that none of the people who have replied were actually assaulted, that the endings were similar to mine, close calls rather than tragedies. But it is still creepy to think that those people are out there, that for every Kenny who gets caught there are others who do not, who continue to smile and kneel and make children feel special while hiding their true natures behind masks of normalcy and friendliness. They are in our homes, our schools, our churches, our communities, waiting for the opportunity that careful parents deny them, waiting for the trust that they have not yet betrayed. I still live in that colonial house, the one with the creaky floors and the proper paint colors and the addition that took 2.5 years to complete. I walk through the new room every day, use it for its intended purpose, entertain guests who complement the seamless blend of old and new. But part of me is always aware, always watching, always listening for the sound of footsteps that do not belong. I have never told my own children about Kenny, have never explained why I am so careful, so vigilant, so unwilling to leave them alone with anyone whose face I do not know and whose history I have not verified. They think I am just a protective mother, and I let them think that, because the truth is too dark for childhood, too heavy for innocence, too close to the bone for anyone who has not lived it. But I know what was standing in my kitchen, smiling at me, asking about my favorite cartoons. I know what he was, what he had done, what he was capable of doing. I know how close I came, how close my family came, to being a different kind of story, the kind that ends in tragedy instead of creeps and what ifs. And I know that the world is full of Kennys, full of smiling faces that hide dark histories, full of contractors who think some details are unnecessary to share, full of church connections that mask rather than reveal the truth. I know that vigilance is exhausting, that suspicion is draining, that living in fear is no way to live at all. But I also know that the alternative, the trust that my parents placed in a smiling man from church, almost cost me everything. So I check the locks twice. I ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. I watch my children with an intensity that sometimes makes them squirm. And when I walk through the addition, when I touch the painted trim that my parents fought so hard for, when I hear the floorboards creak beneath my feet, I remember Kenny. I remember his smile, his voice, his kneeling posture, his gap-toothed grin. I remember the lemonade pitcher sweating in my small hands, the sun beating down, the feeling of being special and seen and important. And I remember the newspaper article, my mother's gasp, my father's rage, the realization that the friendly man who had made me feel so grown up was something else entirely, something that had no place in a child's world, something that had been invited into our home by trust and faith and the terrible assumption that people are basically good. They are not all good. Some of them are Kennys, waiting in doorways, smiling in kitchens, calculating their next move while children carry them lemonade, and parents trust in connections that should mean something, but sometimes mean nothing at all. And the creeps that thinking about this gives me, the shiver that runs down my spine, the nausea that rises in my throat when I remember his face, those are the price of survival, the cost of awareness, the burden of knowing that the world is darker than we want it to be, and that the only protection we have is our willingness to see the darkness before it sees us. I still live in that house. I still walk through that room. And I still, after all these years, sleep with my bedroom door locked. Not because I am afraid of ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night, but because I am afraid of the Kennys, the smiling men, the friendly faces that hide the worst kind of evil behind ordinary features and ordinary jobs and ordinary church attendance. I am afraid because I know they are real, because I met one, because he made me lemonade and asked about my day and looked at me with eyes that I now know were hungry. And I will never, ever let my guard down again, because the price of that trust is too high, the risk too great, the memory of what could have happened too vivid to ever fully fade. I was 13 years old the night everything changed. It was the first time I had gotten my period, and my body felt strange and unfamiliar in ways I did not understand yet. I was cramping and uncomfortable and everything felt wrong, so I ended up sleeping on my back, which was something I almost never did. I have always been a side sleeper, curled up like a question mark under my blankets. But that night I was flat on my back, staring at the ceiling until sleep finally pulled me under. I was dreaming. In the dream I was sitting in a chair, the kind with wooden legs and a hard seat that creaks when you move. I leaned back, balancing it on two legs the way kids do when they are bored, and for a moment everything felt normal, almost playful. But then the chair kept leaning, further and further back, past the point where gravity should have caught it, past the point where it should have tipped over and crashed to the floor. It kept going, tilting into an impossible angle, and I realized there was nothing behind me anymore. No floor, no wall, no ground at all. Just empty space stretching down forever. A black void that swallowed the light and the sound and everything that made sense in the world. I was falling backward into eternity, and there was nothing to grab, nothing to stop me, nothing to scream into, except the silence that was already inside my mouth. The dream felt too real, too heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest while I fell. I could feel my heart racing, feel my lungs burning for air that was not there, feel the panic building in my throat like a scream that had nowhere to go. And then I jolted awake. My eyes snapped open, and I was back in my room, back in my bed, back in the dark, where everything was supposed to be safe and familiar. But something was wrong. I could feel it before I could see it. A presence in the room that did not belong there. A weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and that was when I saw it. It was hovering directly above my face. I could not move. I could not scream. I could not even blink. My body was frozen, locked in place by something that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with the thing that was leaning over me. The face was the first thing I saw, and it was the only thing I could focus on, the only thing that mattered in that moment. It was white, a flat and ovular shape that looked almost like a mask someone had stretched too tight across a skull. There were no wrinkles, no pores, no imperfections that would have made it human. It was smooth and pale and wrong in a way that made my stomach twist into knots. The eyes were huge, glassy and round, like the eyes of a fish that had been pulled from deep water where the light never reached. They did not reflect anything. They just stared, empty and endless, and filled with something that was not quite hate, but was close enough to burn. The eyebrows were arched high up on that flat forehead, pulled into an expression of fury so intense it looked like the face was cracking under the pressure of its own anger. The lips were thin and quivering, pressed together in a line that trembled with the effort of holding something back. I could see the muscles in those pale cheeks twitching, see the jaw working like it was chewing on words it could not speak. And where a nose should have been, there were just two dark holes, empty and deep, and somehow worse than any nose could have been. They looked like they went all the way back into the skull, like if I looked hard enough I would see the darkness inside its head. But the worst part was the feeling. I could feel its hate. It was not just looking at me. It was burning through me, pressing against my skin like heat, from a fire that was too close. It wanted me, not my body, not my blood, not anything physical that I could understand. It wanted something deeper, something that lived behind my ribs and behind my eyes, something that made me me. It wanted to devour my soul, to swallow whatever made me alive, and leave nothing behind but an empty shell staring at the ceiling. I have never felt more helpless in my life. Not before that night, and not since. Because this was not just about dying. I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that if this thing got what it wanted, I would be gone in a way that death could not touch. There would be no heaven, no peace, no rest. Just nothing, forever, while this thing wore my absence like a trophy. I tried to move my fingers. Nothing. I tried to scream, to make any sound that might wake my parents in the next room, might bring someone running to pull this thing away from me. My throat was locked, my vocal cords frozen, my lungs burning with air I could not push out. I was trapped inside my own body, watching this creature lean closer and closer, feeling its breath on my face, even though those nose holes did not seem capable of breathing. Then, somehow, I made a sound. It was the smallest whimper, barely more than a breath pushed through clenched teeth, but it was enough. The moment that sound escaped me, the thing reacted. It did not flinch or recoil. It stood up straight, pulling away from my face with a motion that was too smooth, too fluid, like gravity did not apply to it the way it applied to everything else in the room. It moved to the foot of my bed and began to pace. Back and forth, never breaking eye contact with me. Its steps were silent on the carpet, but I could feel each one in my chest like a drumbeat. It was angry now, furious that I had slipped through its fingers, that something had stopped it from taking what it wanted. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up and my teeth ache. It was like there was a force field around my bed, something invisible that this thing could not cross. I could feel its frustration radiating through the room, waves of hate and hunger crashing against a barrier I could not see. It looked like a starving tiger pacing behind glass at a zoo, muscles coiled and ready to spring, eyes locked on prey that was just out of reach. It wanted to lunge at me, wanted to tear through whatever was protecting me and finish what it had started. But it could not. I sat up slowly, my body still heavy and unresponsive, my muscles screaming with the effort of moving against whatever had pinned me down. I kept my eyes on it, afraid that if I looked away, even for a second, the barrier would break and it would be on me. It was tall, so tall that its head almost brushed the ceiling, and impossibly thin beneath that long black cloak. The cloak covered everything, every part of its body except that terrible face, and it moved in a way that made the fabric flow like liquid shadow. I realized then that it had not been floating over me. It had been standing at the foot of my bed the whole time, leaning forward until its face was inches from mine, close enough that I could have counted the quivering lines around its thin lips if I had been capable of thinking that clearly. The bed was not very high, but this thing was so tall and so thin that it could bend like a straw in the wind, folding itself over me without ever climbing onto the mattress. My closet door was cracked open a few inches behind it, a sliver of deeper darkness in a room that was already too dark. The thing noticed me looking at the closet, and in a movement that made my stomach drop, it swooped toward the door. It did not walk. It did not run. It glided, its cloak billowing around legs I still could not see, and slipped through that narrow crack like smoke through a keyhole. It peered out at me from the darkness inside my closet, its white face floating in the black like a moon that had fallen from the sky and landed in the worst possible place. Those glassy eyes never left mine. Even in the shadow of the closet I could see them gleaming, could feel them pulling at something inside my chest. It stayed there, quivering with hate and frustration, its thin lips pressed together so tight they looked like they might split open. And then, slowly, it began to fade. Not like a ghost in a movie, not all at once in a puff of smoke. It faded piece by piece, the white face dimming first, then the black cloak dissolving into the darkness behind it, then the eyes lingering longest of all, two pale spots in the black that stayed visible for a heartbeat after everything else was gone. And then there was nothing, just my closet door, cracked open a few inches, and the silence of a room that felt emptier than it should have. I lay there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in short gasps that I could not control. I could still feel the hate. It clung to the air like smoke, like the smell of something burning that you cannot find. I waited for it to come back, waited for the closet door to swing open and that face to emerge again, hungrier and angrier than before. When I finally found the courage to move, I reached for my lamp and turned it on. The light was too bright, too harsh, but I did not care. I left it on. I sat up in my bed, pulling my knees to my chest, and stared at that closet door until my eyes burned. I did not sleep again that night. I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face hovering over me, felt that hate pressing against my skin, heard the silence of that room where something had tried to take my soul. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on my room entirely. I grabbed my blanket and crept down the hallway, past my parents' closed door, into the living room where the street light through the window made everything look gray and unreal. I turned on every light I could find. The overhead fixture, the lamp by the couch, the light in the kitchen that my mom always complained about wasting electricity. I sat on the couch with all the lights blazing around me, wrapped in my blanket, staring at the walls and waiting for morning. I never slept with that closet door open again. For years, I made sure it was shut tight before I got into bed, checking it twice, sometimes 3 times, like the ritual would keep something from coming back through. I told myself it was sleep paralysis. That was the explanation that made sense, the one doctors and teachers and everyone else would believe. My brain had woken up before my body, and the figure was just a hallucination, created by fear and immobility. It was a very believable explanation, very plausible, and I held on to it for years like a life raft in an ocean of doubt. I finished high school. I went to college. I made friends and lost friends and grew up in all the normal ways that people grow up. And then I met her. She was in one of my classes, a quiet girl with dark hair and nervous hands who always sat in the back row and never spoke unless the professor called on her. We started talking after class one day, about nothing important at first, about assignments and deadlines and the coffee shop down the street that stayed open until midnight. Then, one night, she told me a story. We were sitting in her apartment, just the two of us, and the conversation had drifted into things we did not usually talk about. Fears, nightmares, things that happened in the dark when nobody else was awake. She hesitated for a long time, twisting a strand of hair around her finger. And then she started to speak. She had been up late one night, she said, sitting in her room with the door open because the air conditioning in her apartment was broken and she needed the draft from the hallway to keep cool. She was scrolling through her phone, not really paying attention to anything, when something in the living room caught her eye. A movement, a shadow, something that did not belong in the space between her door and the kitchen. She looked up, and there was a figure standing in her living room. It was beckoning to her, she said, one thin arm raised, one pale finger curling in a motion that was meant to be inviting, but looked more like a hook, trying to pull her forward. She looked away, blinked hard, told herself she was seeing things. that the late hour and the dim light were playing tricks on her mind. Then she looked back, and it was still there, still beckoning, still waiting. She described it to me, and with every word she spoke, I felt the blood drain from my face. The flat white face, the huge glassy eyes, the arched eyebrows pulled high with anger, the thin quivering lips, the two holes where a nose should have been, the long black cloak that hid everything except that terrible face, the impossible height, the skeletal thinness, the way it moved like smoke and shadow instead of flesh and bone. It was the same creature, the exact same thing that had leaned over my bed when I was 13 years old, that had tried to take my soul while I lay frozen and helpless beneath it. I could not speak. I just stared at her, my mouth dry, my hands shaking in my lap. She noticed my reaction and stopped talking, her eyes widening with a fear that mirrored my own. I asked her if she had ever told anyone else this story. She shook her head. I asked her if she had ever heard my story before tonight. She shook her head again, slower this time, like she was afraid of what my questions meant. I got up and walked to her desk, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding in my ears. I found 2 sketchbooks in her drawer, blank pages waiting to be filled. I handed her one and kept the other. Without speaking, we both started to draw. My hand moved without my permission, sketching lines and shapes that I had tried for years to forget. That face that had haunted my dreams and my waking hours alike. The flat oval, the glassy eyes, the arched brows, the thin lips, the holes where the nose should have been. When we finished, we traded sketchbooks. I looked at her drawing, and my breath caught in my throat. It was the same face, the same proportions, the same expression, the same impossible wrongness that made it look less like a drawing and more like a photograph of something that should not exist. She was staring at my drawing with the same expression I knew was on my own face, the look of someone who has just realized that the nightmare they thought was private was shared by someone else. She had never heard my story before telling hers. I had never told anyone the details of that night, not the way the face looked, not the way it moved, not the way it had faded into my closet like smoke into shadow. We had both seen the same thing, in different houses, in different years, under different circumstances, and we had both tried to convince ourselves that we were crazy, that our minds had invented something terrifying to explain a moment of fear, but we had not invented it. It was real. It had found both of us, and maybe it had found others too, people who were too afraid to speak, too convinced by the sleep paralysis explanation to ever admit what they had really seen. I think about that night a lot, more than I used to, more than I want to. I think about what would have happened if I had not made that tiny whimper, if the barrier around my bed had not held, if that thing had gotten what it came for. I think about the girl in my class, about the figure beckoning her from her living room, about how close she came to walking toward it, about what might have happened if she had. I think about all the people who wake up in the dark and feel something watching them, all the people who dismiss it as dreams or imagination or the tricks of a tired brain. And I think about that closet door, cracked open a few inches, and the face that peered out from the darkness inside, never breaking eye contact, never blinking, never giving up. I still sleep with the lights on sometimes, when the memory gets too heavy. I still check the closet before I get into bed, and I still wonder, on nights when the darkness feels thicker than it should, whether that thing is still out there, still searching, still hungry for the souls it cannot quite reach. Because if it found me once, and it found her once, then it can find us again. And next time, the barrier might not hold. Next time, I might not be able to make a sound. Next time, the lights might not be enough to keep the dark at bay.